The smell of diesel and pine sap had become so embedded in my skin that Sarah joked I should bottle it as cologne. "Eau de Brennan," she'd say, wrinkling her nose when I came through the door after a 4-day haul. "Notes of 18-wheeler and forest floor." I'd laugh and kiss her forehead and head straight for the shower, scrubbing away the highway grime while my mind was already out in the woods, calculating wind direction and plotting which stand I'd use come Friday morning. 12 years I'd been hauling timber for Mackinac Lumber, running loads from the mills up north down to the yards in Saginaw and Bay City. It was honest work that paid decent and left my weekends free, which was all I'd ever really wanted from a job. The truck was a 2019 Peterbilt that the company let me take home between runs, and I'd customized the sleeper cab with a small refrigerator and a foam mattress that didn't murder my back like the factory one had. I knew every pothole and speed trap on US 23, every diner that served coffee strong enough to strip paint, every rest stop where the showers actually had hot water. But the driving was just what I did to fund what I loved. The hunting, that was who I was. Our property sat on 47 acres outside of Mio, about 20 miles from the Osable State Forest. My grandfather had bought it back in 1962 for what would barely cover a used car today, and my father had added the cabin in the 80s. When Dad passed in 2015, the land came to me along with a lifetime of memories. My first buck at 14, a 6-pointer I'd tracked for 3 hours through fresh snow, teaching Marcus to shoot when he was 10, his small hands trembling with excitement as he squeezed off his first round at a paper target. Countless mornings in the tree stand, watching fog roll through the hardwoods like something alive. I knew those woods the way most men know their living rooms. I could navigate them in the dark by feel alone. The slight dip where the creek bed ran, the stand of white oaks that marked the property line, the rocky outcropping where the big bucks liked to bed down. I'd walked every inch of that land since I was old enough to follow my father without complaining, and I'd never once felt anything but peace out there. That November started like any other. The first week brought hard frost that turned the fallen leaves to crunching sheets of amber and red. Perfect conditions for tracking. I'd taken the week before off from hauling to focus on the rut, when the bucks get stupid with lust and start moving during daylight hours. Sarah had barely seen me. I was out the door before dawn and not back until after dark, surviving on thermos coffee and the venison jerky I'd made from last year's harvest. "You're going to give yourself a heart attack," she said on Wednesday evening, watching me inhale a plate of leftover pot roast at the kitchen table. She was 53, same as me. But she'd aged more gracefully, still had that auburn hair that had caught my eye at the Oscoda County Fair 30 years ago, still had those sharp green eyes that could see right through my bullshit. "When's the last time you slept more than 5 hours?" "I'll sleep when I'm dead." I forked up another bite of roast. "The rut's peaking. You want a freezer full of meat or not?" "I want a husband who doesn't keel over in his tree stand." She sat down across from me, her expression softening. "Marcus called today. Asked if you were going to make his game Friday night." I stopped chewing. Marcus was 17, a junior at Mio Osable High, and he'd somehow turned into a hell of a linebacker despite being built more like me. Wiry, medium height. Not the kind of frame you'd expect to see leveling running backs. He'd hunted with me every season since he was 12. But this year, football had consumed him entirely. I understood it, even if I missed having him out there with me. "What time's kickoff?" 7. It's the last home game before playoffs. I did the math in my head. I could hunt until 4, get cleaned up, make it to the field by 6:30. Tell him I'll be there. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Thank you. It means the world to him, even if he won't admit it. I didn't answer, just squeezed back. Marcus and I had grown distant over the past year. Not fighting, nothing dramatic, just that natural drift that happens when a boy starts becoming his own person. He had his friends, his girlfriend, his football. He didn't need his old man tagging along anymore. I told myself it was normal, healthy even. I told myself I didn't miss him out in those woods every single time I climbed into my stand alone. Thursday morning I was back out before first light, settled into my favorite stand overlooking a natural funnel between 2 ridges. The setup was perfect. A creek to my west that the deer used for water, a thicket of young pines to my east that they bedded in, and a well-worn trail connecting the two that ran directly beneath my position. I'd taken more deer from this spot than I could count. The morning started normally enough. A light wind from the northwest carried my scent away from the trail. The temperature hovered right around freezing, cold enough to keep me alert, but not so cold that my fingers would fumble the rifle. I watched the sky lighten from black to gray to pale pink through the bare branches overhead. Listened to the forest wake up around me. A barred owl's final call before day shift. The skitter of squirrels beginning their endless foraging. The distant caw of crows arguing over something dead. And then around 7:30, everything went quiet. I noticed it the way you notice a sound stopping. That sudden absence that's almost louder than noise. One moment the squirrels were chattering in the oak behind me, and the next they weren't. The crows stopped mid-argument. Even the wind seemed to die, leaving the air perfectly unnaturally still. I remember my first thought being that a hawk must be nearby. Redtails hunted these woods, and their presence often sent the small game into hiding. I scanned the canopy looking for that distinctive silhouette, but saw nothing. Just bare branches against a gray November sky, motionless as a photograph. The silence lasted maybe 5 minutes. I sat frozen in my stand, barely breathing, and I couldn't have told you why my heart had started beating faster. There was no logical reason for fear. I'd experienced quiet mornings before, moments like when the forest seemed to pause and gather itself. But this felt different. This felt like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to pass. Then the crows started up again, distant and agitated, and the squirrels resumed their chattering, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Just a hawk, I told myself. Just a big predator moving through and spooking the game. Nothing to worry about. I didn't see any deer that morning. Not a single one. In all my years hunting that property, I'd never spent 4 hours in that stand without seeing at least a doe or two. I climbed down at 11, uneasy in a way I couldn't articulate, and walked the half-mile back to the cabin to check my trail cameras. I had 6 cameras spread across the property, positioned along trails and near bedding areas and at the 2 food plots I maintained. They were good units, Reconnects, expensive but reliable, and they typically captured hundreds of images per week during the rut. Bucks chasing does, sparring matches, the occasional coyote or turkey. I'd been reviewing the footage every few days, looking for the big 10-pointer I'd seen once in late October. The first camera had nothing. Not a single image in 3 days. I checked the batteries, thinking maybe they'd died. but they showed 90% charge. The camera was functioning perfectly. It just hadn't detected any motion to photograph. The second camera was the same. Third, same. Fourth and fifth, nothing. The sixth camera, positioned near the rocky outcropping at the far edge of my property, had captured one image. Just one. Time-stamped 3:47 a.m. from the previous night. The image was corrupted, full of digital artifacts that fragmented the picture into a mess of pixels and color bleed. But I could make out enough to see that something had triggered the motion sensor, a vertical shape, tall and dark, moving between two pine trees at the edge of the frame. The corruption made it impossible to identify, but the proportions were wrong for a deer. Too tall, too narrow, standing upright like a person. I stared at that image for a long time, zooming in and out on my camera's small display screen, trying to force it to make sense. A person? Who the hell would be on my property at 4 a.m? The nearest neighbor was Pete Kowalczyk, a mile and a half east, and he would have called if he was planning to come out this way. Teenagers, maybe, screwing around where they shouldn't be. Meth heads looking for a place to cook. Neither explanation felt right, but I couldn't think of a better one. The next morning, Friday, I was on the phone with Pete before dawn. "You notice anything weird with your cattle lately?" I asked. Pete ran about 60 head of black Angus on the land between his place and mine, and his pastures bordered the state forest. "Weird how?" "I don't know, acting skittish. Not grazing in certain areas." There was a pause, and when Pete spoke again, his voice had lost some of its casual morning warmth. "Yeah, actually. Last few days they won't go near the tree line on the north side. Just stand there and stare at the woods like they're watching something. Spooky as hell." "You see anything out there?" "Nope. Figured maybe there's a bear denning up nearby. Had one about 5 years back that spooked the herd for a while." I thought about the corrupted trail camera image, that tall, dark shape between the trees. Bears didn't stand upright for that long. "Any of your dogs acting strange?" Another pause, longer this time. "That's the other thing. Molly and Duke have been gone since Tuesday. Figured they went chasing deer and got lost. You know how Duke is, but usually they're back by nightfall." Sarah's worried sick. Molly was a 6-year-old German shepherd, smart as a whip, and Duke was her 3-year-old son, who'd inherited her brains, but none of her caution. They'd never both disappeared at the same time before, and they sure as hell wouldn't have stayed gone for 3 days if they could help it. "You want me to keep an eye out while I'm hunting today?" "Would you? I've got to run to Grayling for a parts order, won't be back until tonight. If you see them, just call." I promised I would, and I meant it, but when I hung up the phone, I felt that cold unease from yesterday settling back into my chest. The silence, the empty trail cameras, Pete's dogs vanishing, his cattle afraid of the tree line. I tried to tell myself it was all coincidence, or maybe a single explanation that I just hadn't figured out yet. A sick bear would explain most of it. They got disoriented sometimes, wandered into populated areas, scared off the deer, and spooked the livestock. Hell, a big enough boar could have killed both dogs if they'd cornered it. That made sense. That was logical. I made Marcus's game that night, sat in the bleachers next to Sarah, and cheered until my voice went hoarse when he sacked the opposing quarterback twice in the fourth quarter. He found us after the game, flushed with victory and surrounded by teammates, and he hugged his mother and gave me one of those too cool for dad nods that still meant more to me than he'd ever know. "Good game, son." "Thanks, Dad. You coming out this weekend?" "Every day until I fill my tag." He grinned, and for a second I saw the little boy who used to beg me to take him out to the woods, who thought his father hung the moon. Get a big one. Saturday morning I found the deer carcasses. There were 3 of them, arranged in a rough triangle in a clearing about 200 yards from my east property line. 2 does, and a young buck, all of them gutted. And I mean precisely gutted. Organs removed with almost surgical care, laid out on the frozen ground beside each body like some kind of offering. But the meat was untouched. Not a single bite taken from any of them. I stood at the edge of that clearing for a long time, my rifle clutched tight against my chest, trying to process what I was seeing. Poachers made no sense. They'd take the meat and leave the guts, not the other way around. Coyotes or wolves would have scattered the remains, not arranged them. And I'd never seen any predator, natural or human, leave 3 kills this close together without consuming at least part of them. The smell hit me then, cutting through the cold November air. Copper and rot, thick enough to taste, underlaid with something else, something musky and wild and wrong, like no animal scent I'd ever encountered. I backed away from that clearing slowly, keeping my rifle up, and I didn't stop until I reached my truck. That night I told Sarah about the carcasses, trying to keep my voice casual, like it was just an unusual find and not something that had kept my hands shaking for an hour after I got home. "You should call the DNR," she said. "Maybe there's something going around. Chronic wasting disease or something." Chronic wasting doesn't make deer pile up in a clearing with their guts laid out like a damn buffet. She looked at me sharply. "Brennan, what are you saying?" I didn't know what I was saying. That was the problem. Every explanation I could think of was wrong somehow, leaving an edge of impossibility that I couldn't smooth away. I told her I'd make some calls on Monday, and I changed the subject to Marcus's game, and I pretended not to notice the worried looks she kept shooting me for the rest of the evening. Sunday I called Pete again. "Dogs come back?" "No." His voice was flat, defeated. "I walked the property line this morning calling for them. Nothing. Found some blood near the old fence line, though. Lot of it." "Jesus, did you call the sheriff?" "Called him yesterday. He said probably coyotes wrote it off. Said there's been reports of a pack denning in the state forest." I thought about those 3 deer, their organs removed with precision no coyote possessed. Did the blood look like coyotes to you? "Brennan." Pete's voice cracked, just slightly. "I've been ranching here for 30 years. I've seen what coyotes do to a carcass. This wasn't coyotes. There was a lot of blood, too much blood, and drag marks heading into the woods, big ones." "What did the sheriff say about that?" "He said sometimes coyotes surprise you. Told me to keep my remaining dogs inside and wait for the pack to move on." A pause. "I don't think it's coyotes, Brennan. I don't know what it is, but it's not coyotes." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and tried to convince myself that Pete was wrong, that grief over his dogs was making him see patterns that weren't there. Bears, I thought. It has to be bears. Maybe a mother with cubs, denning late, desperate for calories before winter. That would explain the aggression, the scattered behavior, even the deer carcasses if you squinted hard enough. But I'd been hunting these woods for over 30 years, and I'd seen exactly 2 black bears in all that time. They weren't common here, and the habitat wasn't quite right. Too much development nearby, not enough of the berries and grubs they preferred. The DNR had never recorded a breeding population in Oscoda County. I called the local DNR office anyway, left a message describing the deer carcasses and asking if they'd had any reports of unusual predator activity. A tired-sounding woman called me back Monday afternoon while I was somewhere between Saginaw and Bay City with a full load. "Mr. Ashford, this is Linda Chen from the DNR. Got your message about the deer." "Yes, ma'am. Thought someone should know." "I appreciate that. We've had a few reports of carcasses in your area over the past week. Probably wolves moving down from the UP, taking advantage of the rut. Lots of easy prey this time of year." "Wolves don't usually leave the meat." "No," she agreed. "But sick ones might, or young ones still learning to hunt, making inefficient kills. We're monitoring the situation. If you see anything else unusual, give us a call, but I wouldn't worry too much. These things usually sort themselves out." I thanked her and hung up and sat in my truck at a rest stop outside Flint, staring at the line of trees behind the building. Wolves, that made more sense than bears at least. There had been confirmed sightings of lone wolves in the northern Lower Peninsula over the past few years, dispersers from the Upper Peninsula packs looking for new territory. A wolf could explain the deer. It could explain Pete's dogs, maybe. But it couldn't explain that shape on my trail camera, standing upright between the trees at 4 a.m. It couldn't explain why that single corrupted image made something deep in my brain want to scream. I got home Tuesday night and found Sarah waiting for me in the kitchen with a cup of tea and an expression I'd learned to recognize over 30 years of marriage. The one that said she'd been worrying about something while I was gone and had worked up the courage to address it. "You've been different lately," she said as I sat down across from her, "since last week. Something's bothering you. Work's been busy." "Don't lie to me, Brennan. You think I can't tell when you're sleeping badly? You've been up every night pacing, checking the locks. You came out of the bedroom last night with the .45 like you expected someone to be in the house." She reached across the table and took my hand. "Talk to me, please." I wanted to tell her. God, I wanted to open my mouth and let everything spill out. The silence in the woods, the corrupted trail camera image, the deer carcasses arranged like offerings. But I could picture how she'd look at me if I did. The concern that would creep into her eyes. The careful questions about whether I'd been feeling stressed, whether I thought maybe talking to someone might help. I couldn't bear that. Not from her. "I think there's something in the woods," I said finally, "something killing deer. Maybe what got Pete's dogs. I've been hunting that land my whole life, Sarah. And something feels wrong out there. Something I can't explain." She squeezed my hand. "Then don't go out there. Stay home this weekend. Take a break." I shook my head. "I need to see it, whatever it is. I need to know what I'm dealing with." She held my gaze for a long moment, and I watched her weigh her words, watched her decide not to push. "Promise me you'll be careful." "Always am." "No, you're not. You're stubborn and reckless, and you think you're invincible." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Promise me anyway." I promised. And Friday morning before dawn, I headed back out to the property with my rifle and my cameras and a determination to find a rational explanation for everything wrong in my woods, to prove to myself that the world still made sense, that there was nothing out there worse than a wolf or a bear or a sick deer. I'd never been more wrong about anything in my life. The drive out to the property felt different that Friday morning. I'd made that same trip hundreds of times over the years, knew every curve and pothole on the two-lane county road that wound through the forest. But something had shifted in the familiar landscape. The trees seemed closer to the asphalt than I remembered, their bare branches reaching across the road like fingers trying to touch. The sky was that particular shade of gray that promised snow but never delivered, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on the world like a lid. I pulled into the gravel drive that led to the cabin around 5:30, a good hour before first light. My headlights swept across the front porch, illuminating the weathered boards and the rocking chair my father had built 30 years ago. And for just a moment I could have sworn I saw something move at the edge of the light. Something tall. Something that ducked back into the shadows between heartbeats. I sat in the truck with the engine running for a full minute, scanning the tree line, my hand resting on the rifle case beside me. Nothing moved. The woods were perfectly still, that absolute silence I'd noticed before, settling over everything like a blanket. No wind, no owls, no skittering of nocturnal creatures going about their business. Just the idling truck and my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I told myself it was nerves, told myself I was seeing things because Sarah had spooked me with her worried looks and her talk about how I'd been acting strange. I grabbed my gear and headed for the cabin, unlocking the door and hitting the lights in one practiced motion, flooding the single room with the harsh glow of bare bulbs. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The gun safe in the corner, the small kitchenette with its ancient propane stove, the cot where I'd spent countless nights after long days in the field. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and gun oil, and something else underneath. That musky, wrong scent I'd caught near the deer carcasses, so faint I might have imagined it. I made coffee on the propane stove and waited for dawn, running through my plan for the day. I'd check all 6 trail cameras first, pull the SD cards and review the footage on my laptop. Then I'd walk the property lines, looking for tracks or scat or any other sign of what had been killing deer and probably Pete's dogs. If I found wolf sign, I'd call the DNR back with specifics. If I found bear sign, unlikely but possible, I'd report that too. And if I found nothing at all, well, at least I'd have tried. The first hint of gray light crept through the cabin's single window around 6:30, and I was out the door before it fully arrived. The trail cameras told me nothing useful. 2 of them had captured a few deer images from earlier in the week, before whatever had spooked the wildlife moved in, but the more recent days showed the same emptiness as before. The camera near the rocky outcropping, the one that had captured that corrupted image, now showed nothing at all. Not even the corrupted frame. When I pulled the SD card and checked it on my laptop back at the cabin, the entire memory had been wiped clean. I sat there staring at the blank folder on my screen, trying to figure out how that was possible. Trail cameras didn't just erase themselves. Someone or something had physically accessed the camera and deleted the files, but the camera had been mounted 12 feet up a pine tree, secured with a cable lock that was still intact when I checked it. I drove to Pete's place around noon, pulling up to his farmhouse in a cloud of dust. He was out by the barn working on a tractor engine, and he straightened up when he saw my truck. Even from a distance, I could see how tired he looked. Dark circles under his eyes, a slump in his shoulders that hadn't been there a week ago. "Any sign of the dogs?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He shook his head slowly, wiping his hands on a rag that was already more oil than cloth. "Nothing. Sarah's convinced they're dead. I keep telling her they might have just run off, found another farm to mooch from, but he trailed off, staring at the tree line that bordered his north pasture. I went out to that fence line again yesterday, the one where I found the blood. And the drag marks are gone like they were never there. Ground's all torn up, but not in the same way. Almost like something... He stopped, shook his head. Never mind, I sound crazy. Pete. I stepped closer, lowered my voice even though there was no one else around to hear. What did you see? He met my eyes, and I saw something there I'd never seen in Pete Kowalczyk before. Fear. Real bone-deep fear. Nothing, he said. I didn't see anything, but I felt it, like something was watching me from the woods, something big. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Christ, Brennan, I've lived here my whole life. I've never been scared of those woods. But yesterday, standing at that fence line, I turned around and damn near ran back to the house. Couldn't have told you why. Just knew I needed to get inside. I thought about the corrupted camera image, the wiped SD card, that tall shape at the edge of my headlights that might have been real or might have been my imagination playing tricks. You tell the sheriff any of that? What would I tell him? That I got spooked by nothing? Pete spat on the ground. He already thinks I'm overreacting about the dogs. Told me straight out that animals disappear all the time, that I shouldn't get so worked up about it. What about the cattle? They still won't graze near the tree line? Worse now. They're bunching up near the barn, won't go more than 50 yards from the buildings. Never seen them act like this, not even when that bear came through years back. He gestured toward the pasture, where I could see his small herd clustered together in the middle of the field, as far from the forest as they could get. Something's got them terrified, Brennan, and I don't think it's wolves. I stayed at Pete's for another hour, helping him with the tractor and talking through possibilities that neither of us really believed. Mountain lion was his best guess. They'd been spotted occasionally in Michigan, mostly in the Upper Peninsula, but there were scattered reports further south. A big male could take down dogs, could spook cattle, could kill deer, and leave them partially consumed. But mountain lions don't stand upright, I said, and immediately wished I hadn't. Pete looked at me sharply. What do you mean, stand upright? I told him about the trail camera image. The corrupted frame showing something tall and vertical between the trees. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled with every word. And the SD card was wiped clean today? Completely. Like the camera was brand new out of the box. Jesus. He rubbed his face with both hands. What the hell is going on out there? I didn't have an answer for him. I drove back to my property as the afternoon light started to fade, determined to spend some time in my tree stand before dark. Whatever was killing deer, whatever had gotten Pete's dogs, it was still out there. And the only way I was going to get answers was by being out there too. The stand overlooking the funnel between the ridges was exactly as I'd left it. I climbed up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible, and settled into position with my rifle across my lap. The woods around me were silent, that same oppressive, unnatural silence I'd noticed before, but I forced myself to focus on the trail below, watching for any movement. An hour passed. Nothing. The light started to fail around 4:30, the gray sky darkening toward purple. I'd brought my headlamp with me, planning to use it for the walk back to the truck, and I clicked it on as the shadows grew deeper. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the bare trunks of the hardwoods surrounding me. That's when I saw the eyes. They were maybe 70 yards out at the edge of my headlamp's effective range. 2 points of amber light reflecting back at me from between the trees. At first I thought they were deer. You get that eye shine from deer all the time when you're hunting at dusk. That distinctive glow as your light catches their retinas. But these weren't at deer height. They were 8 feet off the ground. I sat frozen in my stand. The beam of my headlamp locked on those twin points of light, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. 8 feet. Nothing stood 8 feet tall in these woods. Not deer, not bears, not anything. The eyes moved. They shifted slightly to the left, tracking my headlamp beam as I involuntarily adjusted my grip on the flashlight. And in that movement, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Intelligence. These weren't the eyes of an animal caught in a light. These were the eyes of something that was watching me with purpose, with intent. Something that knew I was there and was studying me the way I might study a deer through my rifle scope. I raised the rifle with shaking hands, trying to center the scope on those amber points. The eyes blinked, a slow, deliberate blink that seemed almost mocking. And then they were gone, vanished into the darkness between one heartbeat and the next. I stayed in that stand for another 10 minutes, not moving, barely breathing. My rifle still raised, and my headlamp still pointed at the spot where those eyes had been. Part of me wanted to climb down and investigate, to walk over there and look for tracks or scat or any evidence that what I'd seen had been real. A larger part of me, the primal animal part that humans like to pretend they've evolved beyond, was screaming at me to get out of these woods as fast as my legs could carry me. I compromised. I climbed down from the stand slowly, keeping my rifle ready, and walked back to the truck without looking behind me. I didn't run. I refused to run. But I moved faster than I had since I was a young man, and I didn't take a full breath until I was in the cab with the doors locked and the engine running. That night I sat in the cabin with every light on and my .45 within arm's reach, telling myself over and over that what I'd seen had been a simple optical illusion, a trick of the headlamp beam. Maybe 2 separate eyes from 2 different animals, positioned by coincidence to look like they were part of the same creature. Maybe reflected light from something else entirely. A piece of metal, a shard of glass, anything but what my gut was telling me I'd seen. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those amber points of light, that slow, knowing blink, the casual way they tracked my movement like a predator sizing up prey. At 3 in the morning, I heard something walking outside the cabin. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, circling the building with a patience that made my skin crawl. I sat on the cot with my pistol raised, tracking the sound as it moved from the front porch to the east wall to the back and around to the west. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to be quiet. It wanted me to know it was there. The circling stopped at the cabin's single window. I heard what might have been breathing. Deep, rumbling breaths that fogged the glass from the outside. I couldn't see anything through the window. The lights inside had destroyed my night vision, and whatever was out there was standing just outside the reach of the cabin's glow. We stayed like that for what felt like hours. Me on the cot with my pistol, whatever it was at the window. Both of us waiting for the other to make a move. Eventually the breathing stopped, and I heard those heavy footsteps retreating into the forest, fading until the only sound was my own ragged pulse. I left at first light and drove straight home. I told Sarah I'd come down with a stomach bug. Not a complete lie given how sick I'd felt since seeing those eyes, and spent the rest of the weekend trying to convince myself that everything could still be explained rationally. Pete called me Sunday afternoon. His voice was hollow, mechanical, like a man in shock. "Found Duke," he said, "what was left of him." "Jesus, Pete, I'm sorry." "Brennan." A long pause. "He was in a tree 15 feet up, wedged in a fork of the branches, like something put him there. On purpose." I didn't know what to say to that. Couldn't think of any animal, any predator, any natural explanation for a 60-pound German shepherd being carried up a tree and left there like a trophy. "There's something in those woods," Pete said. "Something that's not supposed to be there. And it's not wolves, and it's not bears, and it's not any goddamn mountain lion." "I know," I said. "I saw its eyes." The week that followed was the longest of my life. I drove my routes mechanically, barely seeing the road, my mind churning through possibilities that ranged from the improbable to the impossible. During my overnight stops, I sat in truck stop diners researching everything I could think of. Unusual predators, escaped exotic animals, misidentified wildlife. I found stories about wolves attacking dogs, bears climbing trees, even the occasional mountain lion sighting in the lower peninsula. None of it explained eyes 8 feet off the ground. None of it explained a dog being carried up a tree like a display. I called the sheriff's office on Tuesday, asked to speak with whoever had taken Pete's initial report. The deputy who called me back sounded bored, dismissive. "Mr. Kowalczyk's dogs?" "Yeah, I took that call. A sad situation, but it happens." "Coyotes, probably. They've been aggressive this year." "The dog was found in a tree 15 feet up." A pause. "Sir?" "A tree wedged in the branches. You want to tell me how a coyote managed that?" The deputy's voice hardened. "I'm not aware of any details like that in the report, Mr. Ashford. Are you sure your friend isn't exaggerating, making things up?" I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles went white. "I've known Pete Kowalczyk for 20 years. He's the most level-headed man I know. If he says his dog was in a tree, his dog was in a goddamn tree." "Well, sir, unless you have evidence of criminal activity, I'm not sure what you expect us to do. Wildlife management is DNR jurisdiction, not ours." I hung up on him, called the DNR next, got transferred 3 times before reaching someone who would actually listen to me. I told them about the deer carcasses, Pete's dogs, the cattle refusing to graze near the tree line. The woman on the other end, different from the one I'd talked to before, took notes and promised to send someone out to investigate. "Might be a couple weeks," she said. "We're short-staffed this time of year." A couple weeks. Whatever was in those woods could kill half the county in a couple weeks. Friday came around again, and I found myself loading my rifle into the truck, despite every instinct telling me to stay home. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as I checked my gear, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of worry and frustration. "You don't have to go," she said when I came back inside for my coffee thermos. "Whatever's out there, let someone else deal with it. The DNR, the sheriff, anyone but you. Someone has to figure out what it is. If I can get proof, a photo, tracks, anything concrete, then maybe someone will actually take this seriously. And if it's not just some animal, if it's..." She trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. "Then I'll know that too." I kissed her goodbye and drove out to the property, arriving in the pale gray light of early morning. The cabin was exactly as I'd left it. No signs of disturbance. But I checked every window and door anyway before setting out. The silence was back. That thick, oppressive absence of sound that seemed to swallow everything. I spent the morning searching for tracks. The ground was hard from days of freezing temperatures. Not ideal for holding prints. But I found what I was looking for near the rocky outcropping at the far edge of my property. The tracks were unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were vaguely canine in shape, elongated pads, deep claw marks, but the proportions were all wrong. Too large for one thing. Each print was easily 7 inches long and nearly as wide, bigger than any wolf track I'd ever encountered. And they were deep, pressed into the frozen ground with a weight that suggested something massive. But the strangest thing was their spacing. The tracks led across a small clearing in a line, one after another, as if the animal had been walking on 2 legs. The stride length was enormous, nearly 4 feet between prints, and there was no sign of a front limb touching down at any point. I photographed everything, took measurements, noted the direction of travel. The tracks led into the deepest part of the forest, toward state land that I rarely ventured into. I followed them for maybe a quarter mile before the ground grew too hard to hold impressions, and the trail disappeared into a tangle of fallen timber and dense undergrowth. I stood at the edge of that tangle, staring into the shadows between the trees, and I felt it again. That sensation of being watched, of eyes tracking my every movement from somewhere I couldn't see. "I know you're there," I said, and my voice sounded strange in that dead silence, swallowed up by the stillness. "Whatever you are, I know you're watching." Nothing answered. But the feeling intensified, a pressure against my skull, a prickling at the back of my neck that made every hair stand on end. I backed away slowly, not turning my back on that tangle of shadow until I was well clear of it. Then I walked. Didn't run, wouldn't let myself run. Back to the cabin, got in my truck, and drove to the spot where I'd seen those eyes from my tree stand. The ground there was softer, shaded by the canopy overhead, and I found more tracks. The same impossible prints, the same bipedal gait. But there was something else here too. Scratches on the bark of a nearby oak, starting about 5 feet off the ground and extending upward as far as I could see. Deep gouges that had torn through the bark to the pale wood beneath, spaced like fingers, like a hand reaching up to grip the trunk. I photographed that too. Then I drove to Pete's farm, showed him everything on my phone. He looked at the images for a long time without speaking, his face growing paler with each swipe. "What the hell leaves tracks like that?" he finally asked. "Nothing I know of. Nothing that's supposed to exist." "So what do we do?" I didn't have an answer for him. Called the DNR again when I got home, left an urgent message describing the tracks and asking them to expedite their investigation. Called the sheriff's office, got the same deputy. Hung up when he started asking if I'd been under stress lately. That night I sat in my living room with all the lights on, my laptop open to a search engine, typing in queries I would have laughed at a week ago. Large bipedal predator Michigan, unexplained animal attacks northern Michigan, cryptid sightings forest. The results ranged from obviously fake to disturbingly plausible. Stories of hunters encountering things that couldn't exist. Reports of livestock mutilations that matched what I'd seen with the deer. Eyewitness accounts of creatures that walked on 2 legs but weren't human, that stood 7 feet tall or more, that had the features of wolves but the intelligence of something far worse. I read until 3 in the morning, until Sarah came downstairs and found me staring at my screen with bloodshot eyes. "Come to bed," she said softly. "Whatever this is, it'll still be there tomorrow." That's what I'm afraid of. The third encounter came 3 nights later. I'd convinced myself to go back out to the property, partly because I needed more evidence to prove I wasn't crazy, and partly because I couldn't stand not knowing what was out there. The days were shorter now, darkness falling before 5 o'clock, and I'd planned to spend a few hours in my stand before heading back to the cabin for the night. The afternoon was unremarkable. No deer, no wildlife of any kind. Just that pervasive silence that had become the new normal in my woods. I sat in the stand and watched the light fade, my headlamp ready, my rifle loaded with the hollow point rounds I'd switched to after that first night. Around 6 o'clock, with the last traces of sunset bleeding from the sky, I heard movement. It came from the ridge to my west. Heavy footfalls that made no attempt at stealth, crashing through the underbrush with a weight that shook the ground even from 100 yards away. I raised my rifle, clicked on my headlamp, scanned the tree line with my heart hammering in my chest. The movement stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the moon broke through the clouds, nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows, and I saw it. It was standing on the ridge, silhouetted against the sky. Even in silhouette, I could tell it wasn't human. The proportions were wrong. Shoulders too broad, arms too long, head shaped in a way that made my mind recoil. It stood on 2 legs, that much was clear, but it stood the way a man might stand if a man were 7 feet tall and built like a nightmare. I couldn't make out details. The moon was behind it, turning the creature into a black cutout against the gray sky. But I could see the general shape, and that shape was enough. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand that tall, that easily, for that long. And bears don't have shoulders that wide. Don't hold their arms away from their bodies, like they're ready to grab something. Bears don't tilt their heads the way this thing tilted its head, watching me with a predator's patience. It wasn't a man either. Men don't have that silhouette. Men don't move with that particular wrongness, that sense of power barely contained, and men don't stand motionless on a ridge in freezing temperatures, watching a hunter in a tree stand like he's the most interesting thing in the world. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. I don't know how long we stayed like that, watching each other across the dark forest. My finger was on the trigger, but I couldn't make myself squeeze. Some part of me, the rational part, the part that still desperately wanted this to be explainable, kept insisting that I was seeing wrong, that the distance and the moonlight were playing tricks, that if I just waited a little longer, it would turn out to be some weird combination of branches and shadows. The creature moved first. It took a step forward down the ridge toward my position, and in that single step I saw enough to know this was no trick of the light. It moved like nothing I'd ever seen, fluid and powerful and completely wrong. Its gait neither human nor animal, but something else entirely, something in between, something that had no business existing in any world I understood. I fired. The shot thundered through the silent forest, and I saw the muzzle flash illuminate the thing for just a fraction of a second, enough to see fur thick and dark, enough to see that terrible silhouette resolved into 3 dimensions, enough to see it flinch as the bullet found its mark, but it didn't fall. It turned and vanished into the trees with a speed that seemed impossible for something that size. I heard it crashing through the undergrowth, the sound fading rapidly as it put distance between us, and then silence. That horrible, oppressive silence that seemed to mock me. I stayed in the stand until my hands stopped shaking enough to climb down safely. I walked back to the cabin in the dark, my headlamp casting a small circle of light that suddenly seemed laughably inadequate. I kept my rifle raised the entire way, spinning at every sound, real or imagined. The cabin was empty, undisturbed. I locked the door, checked every window, sat on the cot with my back to the wall and my pistol in my hand. I didn't sleep. Couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that silhouette against the sky, that terrible wrongness of proportion and movement. Around 3 a.m, I heard it circling the cabin again. Those same heavy footsteps, that same deliberate pace. It walked around the building twice, maybe 3 times, and then it stopped at the window like before. But this time I could see it. The cabin lights were off. I'd turned them out, thinking darkness might make me less visible, and the moon was bright enough to cast faint illumination through the glass. I could see a shape outside the window, massive and dark, and I could see those amber eyes reflecting the distant moonlight as they stared in at me. We watched each other for a long time. It could have broken through that window easily, I knew that, could see the size of it, could imagine those hands I'd glimpsed on the trail camera tearing through the old wooden frame like paper. But it didn't. It just stood there, breathing that deep, rumbling breath that fogged the glass, watching me with those intelligent yet predatory eyes. Eventually it left. I heard those footsteps retreating into the forest, heard them fade until the silence returned. I sat on the cot with my pistol raised until dawn broke, and then I got in my truck and drove home. I told myself, on that drive, that there had to be an explanation, that what I'd seen was some kind of mutation, maybe a wolf with gigantism, a bear with a spinal deformity that forced it to walk upright. Something rare, something science hadn't documented yet, but something natural, something that belonged in the world I understood. I didn't believe it, not really, but I needed to believe it, needed to cling to that last shred of rational thought, because the alternative was accepting that I'd seen something impossible, something that looked at me with intelligence and hunger and what might have been recognition, something that knew who I was and where I lived, and how to find me. I didn't tell Sarah what I'd seen, couldn't find the words. She knew something was wrong. I could see it in her eyes every time she looked at me, that mixture of worry and fear that was becoming her permanent expression. But she didn't push. Maybe she was afraid of what I might say. Maybe she'd already started thinking about therapists and medications and whatever else you do when your husband starts seeing monsters in the woods. Instead, I went back to my research, spent every free moment digging through reports and accounts and old stories, looking for anything that matched what I'd seen. The more I read, the more I found. Encounters going back decades, centuries even. Different names, different details, but always the same basic description. Something that walked like a man but wasn't. Something with the features of a wolf and the intelligence of a human. Something that hunted in the deep woods and left no survivors to tell its story. Except sometimes there were survivors. Sometimes people got away like I had. And their stories all shared one common thread. The thing didn't just hunt. It watched. It studied. It learned. And then when it was ready, it struck. I started carrying my pistol everywhere after that night. Not just in the woods, everywhere, to the grocery store, to the gas station, to bed. Sarah noticed, of course. She noticed everything now, watching me with those worried eyes that seemed to follow me around the house like I was some kind of dangerous animal that might snap at any moment. Maybe she wasn't wrong. I felt dangerous, felt like something inside me had shifted, rewired itself for survival in ways I didn't fully understand. The fear had changed me, was changing me still, and I didn't know how to explain that to her without sounding like I'd lost my mind. The thing was, I hadn't lost my mind. That was the worst part. I wished I could dismiss what I'd seen as some kind of hallucination or psychotic break. That would have been easier. That would have meant medication and therapy and eventually maybe getting back to normal. But I knew what I'd seen was real. The trail camera footage was real. The silhouette against the moonlit ridge was real. Those amber eyes watching me through the cabin window were real. And whatever was out there in my woods was still there, still watching, still waiting. I kept driving my regular routes during the week, kept hauling timber from the mills to the distribution centers like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I couldn't focus on the road anymore, couldn't let my mind wander the way it used to during those long highway hours. Instead, I found myself scanning the tree lines, watching the shadows, looking for any sign of movement that didn't belong. I started taking different routes, avoiding the stretches of road that cut through dense forest. I turned down loads that would have required night driving. My dispatcher thought I was going soft, getting old. Let him think whatever he wanted. He didn't know what was out there. Pete called me a few days after the cabin incident, wanting to know if I'd figured out what was killing deer on my property. I told him I was still working on it, that I'd set up more cameras and was waiting for results. He offered to come out and help me investigate, bring his dogs and his rifle, and spend a weekend tracking whatever it was. I almost said yes. Almost. Then I thought about those amber eyes, about the size of that silhouette, about the way it had circled my cabin like it was testing my defenses, learning my patterns. I thought about Pete's dogs. Wondered if they'd end up like Duke. Vanished into the woods, leaving nothing behind but an empty collar. Nah, I told him. It's probably nothing. Bear, most likely. DNR said they've had some sightings in the area. DNR didn't say that last time you talked to them, Pete said, and I could hear the confusion in his voice. You said they told you there was nothing unusual. They updated me, new information. I was lying through my teeth, and Pete probably knew it. We'd been friends for 15 years, hunted together for most of that time. He knew when I was bullshitting him, but he also knew when to drop a subject. And something in my voice must have told him this was one of those times. All right, he said slowly. Well, you let me know if you need anything. If that bear's still causing trouble, we can take care of it together. Sure, I said. I'll let you know. I hung up the phone and sat in my truck in the grocery store parking lot for a long time, watching the sun set behind the tree line at the edge of town. The shadows were lengthening, reaching across the asphalt like dark fingers, and I felt that familiar tightness in my chest that had become my constant companion. The fear. Always the fear. That night I went back to the property. I don't know why. Some part of me needed to understand, needed to see more, needed to prove to myself that what I'd witnessed wasn't as terrible as I remembered. Memory plays tricks, I told myself. Fear distorts everything. Maybe if I went back, saw the woods in daylight, walked the trails I'd walked 1,000 times before, I'd realize I'd been exaggerating. imagining things. Maybe the silhouette had been smaller than I thought, the eyes lower than I remembered. Maybe there was still a rational explanation waiting for me if only I could find it. I got there around 5 in the evening with about 2 hours of light left. The days were getting shorter now, November giving way to December, and the cold had settled into the forest, like it meant to stay. I parked by the cabin, grabbed my rifle, the point .30-06, loaded with the heaviest rounds I owned, and started walking the perimeter of my property, checking the cameras, looking for signs, trying to act like a normal hunter doing normal things. The first 2 cameras showed nothing unusual. Deer, raccoons, a fox that had been making regular appearances for the past few months. Normal, natural, the world as it should be. The world as I started to relax just a little, started to think maybe whatever had been there had moved on, found other territory, other prey. The 3rd camera changed everything. It was mounted on an oak tree about 30 yards from the main trail, positioned to capture anything moving through a natural corridor between 2 dense thickets. I'd set it up years ago, checked it hundreds of times. The footage was usually unremarkable. Deer, the occasional turkey, sometimes a coyote passing through. But when I popped the SD card into my handheld viewer, my blood went cold. The timestamp said 2:17 a.m. 3 nights ago. The image was grainy, the infrared lighting casting everything in that ghostly green-white glow that always made the woods look like something from a horror movie. But what the camera had captured wasn't ambient creepiness. What it had captured was a face, not a full face. The thing had been moving, passing through the frame at an angle that only caught part of its profile, but I could see enough. Dear God, I could see enough. The snout was long, elongated like a wolf's, but the proportions were wrong. Too heavy in the jaw, with lips that seemed to curl back from teeth that caught the infrared light and gleamed like wet bone. The teeth themselves were massive, canines that had to be 3 inches long, set in a mouth that seemed too wide, too full, like it had been designed for tearing rather than just biting. I could see the texture of the fur on its cheek and neck, coarse, thick, matted in places with something dark that might have been blood or might have been worse. The fur was gray-brown, the color of dead leaves and old bark, the kind of coloring that would let it disappear into the forest like it had never been there at all. But it was the eye that destroyed me. Just one eye, caught at the edge of the frame. But it was enough. It wasn't the eye of an animal. Animals have eyes that are designed for specific purposes. Predator or prey, hunter or hunted. This eye was something else entirely. It was amber, shot through with flecks of gold and darker brown, and it held an intelligence that made my stomach flip. It was looking at the camera. Not at the woods, not at the trail, not at whatever prey might be passing through. At the camera. At the device I'd mounted on that tree. At me. It knew. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that image on the tiny screen. Long enough for the light to change, for the shadows to stretch and deepen around me. Long enough for that familiar silence to descend on the woods. That terrible absence of sound that I now knew to be a warning. When I finally looked up from the viewer, the forest had gone quiet around me, and the fear was back, stronger than ever, clawing at my chest like a living thing. I ran. Not walked, not jogged. Ran. Full sprint through the woods, crashing through underbrush. Not caring about noise or caution or anything except getting back to my truck, getting away from that trail camera and the thing that had looked into it like it was looking into my soul. My boots pounded the frozen ground. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I didn't slow down until I reached the clearing where my truck was parked. I drove home with the image burned into my brain, that snout, those teeth, that eye, the intelligence behind it. Sarah tried to talk to me when I got back, tried to ask about my day, but I brushed past her and went straight to the computer. I had to know, had to understand, had to find something, anything that would explain what I'd seen. The research consumed me over the following days. I abandoned any pretense of normalcy, spending every free moment digging through obscure websites, old newspaper archives, academic papers that danced around the edges of what I was really looking for. Cryptozoology forums became my nightly reading, the testimonies of people who claimed to have seen things like what I'd seen. Most of them sounded crazy, rambling, incoherent, full of contradictions and obvious fabrications. But some of them sounded exactly like me. Sane people, rational people. People who had seen something that shattered their understanding of the world and were desperately trying to make sense of the pieces. The term I kept encountering was Dogman. It sounded ridiculous when I first read it, like something from a bad horror movie or a campfire story designed to scare children. But the accounts were consistent in ways that couldn't be dismissed as simple fabrication. The height, always 7 feet or taller. The proportions, humanoid but wrong, shoulders too broad, limbs too long. The face, canine, predatory, intelligent. The eyes, always described as aware, calculating, watching. And the behavior, not the mindless aggression of a wild animal, but something more deliberate, methodical, patient. The encounters clustered in specific regions, I noticed. The Upper Peninsula, northern Wisconsin, Minnesota, areas with deep, old-growth forests where humans rarely ventured. Areas like mine. The accounts went back decades, centuries even, if you included the old indigenous stories that researchers had started connecting to the modern sightings. The Ojibwe had names for it, names I couldn't pronounce, but whose translations made my blood run cold. The hunters in the dark, the watchers between worlds, the things that wore the shapes of wolves but thought like men. I didn't tell Sarah about any of this. Couldn't. She already thought I was losing my grip on reality, already watched me with that mixture of concern and fear that made my chest ache. If I started talking about dogmen and indigenous legends and the thing that had looked into my trail camera with intelligent eyes, she'd call someone. A doctor, a therapist, maybe the police. She'd do it out of love, out of genuine concern for my well-being, but it would destroy everything. They'd lock me up or drug me into submission or both. They'd take away my guns, the only protection I had, and then I'd be helpless when it finally came for me, because I knew with a certainty that went beyond logic or evidence that it was going to come for me. The watching, the circling, the way it had stood outside my cabin window and met my eyes, none of that was the behavior of a mindless predator. It was studying me, learning my patterns, my habits, my weaknesses, like a hunter scouting prey before making the kill. The first concrete sign that I'd become more than just a target of opportunity came on a Tuesday evening, about a week after I'd seen the trail camera footage. Sarah was out for her book club. Marcus was at football practice, and I was alone in the house with nothing but my thoughts and my fear for company. I'd been watching the tree line through the kitchen window. I watched the tree line constantly now, couldn't help myself. When I noticed that the light in my workshop was on, I hadn't been in the workshop in days. Hadn't had any reason to be. All my projects were on hold, all my equipment stored and forgotten. But the light was definitely on, a yellow glow, visible through the small windows. And I knew for certain that I hadn't left it that way. I grabbed my pistol and stepped out onto the back porch, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the wind is stirring the dead leaves. The empty silence of a suburban lot after dark. The motion sensor light by the garage clicked on as I moved, flooding the area with harsh white illumination. But there was nothing there. Nothing visible, anyway. The walk to the workshop was maybe 50 feet. 50 feet across my own backyard, my own property, the space I'd lived in for over a decade. But it felt like miles. Every step was an effort, every shadow a potential threat. The fear had become a physical presence, a weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. By the time I reached the workshop door, my hand was shaking so badly I could barely grip the handle. The door was unlocked. I always locked it. Always. I pushed it open slowly, pistol raised, and stepped inside. The workshop looked normal at first. Tools hanging on their pegboards, workbench cluttered with half-finished projects, the smell of sawdust and machine oil that I'd always associated with peace and productivity. But something was wrong. Something had been moved, disturbed, touched by hands that weren't mine. My hunting gear. The stuff I kept in the workshop instead of the house, the trail cameras I wasn't using, the backup scopes, the maintenance supplies for my rifles. Someone had gone through all of it. The box where I kept the cameras was open, the contents scattered across the workbench. The case for my old spotting scope was lying on the floor, empty. And there, in the middle of everything, placed with obvious deliberation where I couldn't possibly miss it, was one of the collar tags from Duke. The little metal bone-shaped tag that had been attached to his collar when he disappeared into the woods 3 weeks ago. Clean, polished, no sign of dirt or weather damage. Like someone had kept it, preserved it, brought it here to show me. I don't remember much about the next few minutes. I know I searched the workshop, then the yard, then walked the perimeter of my property with my pistol drawn and my heart hammering in my chest. I know I called the sheriff's office and reported a break-in. Listened to the deputy ask me if anything valuable was missing. Tried to explain that the value wasn't the point, without sounding completely insane. I know I sat on my back porch until Sarah came home watching the tree line, waiting for those amber eyes to appear in the darkness. They didn't. Not that night. But the message had been delivered loud and clear. It knew where I lived. It had been inside my workshop, maybe inside my yard while I slept, maybe closer. It had taken Duke's collar tag, had kept it for weeks, and then brought it back to show me that there was nowhere I could hide, nothing I could do to escape its attention. The word prey kept echoing in my head. I was prey now, marked prey. The kind of target that a predator doesn't just stumble upon but chooses, selects, claims, and everything I'd read about predator behavior told me that once a hunter fixated on specific prey, it didn't stop until one of them was dead. The encounters accelerated after that. I started seeing signs everywhere. Footprints in the mud at the edge of my property that were too large and too wrong to be human. Scratch marks on trees that looked like they'd been made by something with claws the size of steak knives. The motion sensor lights tripped constantly at night, flooding the yard with light, but never revealing anything when I looked out the window. Except once, just once, I saw a shape at the edge of the illumination, tall and dark and motionless, watching the house. By the time I got to the door with my rifle, it was gone. I stopped sleeping, couldn't sleep. Every sound was a threat, every creak of the house, a warning that something was coming. I moved a cot into the living room so I could watch both the front and back doors, kept my rifle loaded and within arm's reach at all times. Sarah found me like that one morning, sitting in the dark with my gun across my lap, staring at nothing, and the look on her face nearly broke me. She thought I'd lost my mind. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was what madness felt like, this constant grinding terror, this inability to trust anything, this knowledge that something impossible was out there and it was coming for me and no one would believe me until it was too late. "Brennan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, please tell me what's happening." I wanted to. God, I wanted to so badly. Wanted to tell her everything. The silhouette, the eyes, the trail camera footage, the collar tag. Wanted to hold her and have her hold me and have someone else share this burden of knowledge that was crushing me. But I looked at her face, at the fear already there, at the way her hands were shaking as she stood in the doorway of our living room, and I couldn't do it. Couldn't put this weight on her. Couldn't make her understand something that I barely understood myself. "Just some stress from work," I said, the lie tasting like ash on my tongue. "I'll be fine." She didn't believe me. I could see it in her eyes. But she didn't push, just nodded slowly and turned away, and I heard her crying softly in the bedroom later that night, while I sat in the dark and watched the tree line and waited for the thing that was going to kill me. I tried calling the DNR again, tried the sheriff's office, tried anyone I thought might listen. The DNR officer was polite but dismissive. There were no reports of unusual predator activity in the area, no livestock losses that couldn't be explained by known species, nothing that warranted investigation. The sheriff's deputy who had responded to my break-in report called me back a few days later to say they hadn't found any evidence of forced entry or theft. And was I sure I hadn't just misremembered leaving the workshop light on? Everyone had a rational explanation. Everyone had a reason to believe this was all in my head. I started to wonder if they were right. Maybe I'd imagined the silhouette. Maybe the trail camera footage had been a glitch, a malfunction. My brain filling in details that weren't really there. Maybe Duke's collar tag had been in the workshop all along, and I'd just forgotten putting it there. Maybe the footprints were from a particularly large person. Maybe the scratch marks were from a bear passing through. Maybe there was no monster in my woods, no predator stalking me, no Dogman or cryptid or whatever the hell I thought I'd seen. Maybe the only thing wrong was me. But then I found the deer carcass. It was a Sunday morning, early, before dawn. I'd been sitting on my back porch with coffee, watching the sky lighten over the trees, trying to convince myself that everything was going to be okay. The birds had started singing. A good sign, I'd learned, because the silence that preceded the creature's presence always started with the birds going quiet. I was almost relaxed, almost normal. Then I saw the dark shape lying in the middle of my backyard. I approached it slowly, rifle in one hand, flashlight in the other. At first I thought it might be a dog, a large dog, maybe a stray, that had wandered onto my property and died during the night. But as I got closer, the flashlight beam illuminating the shape in harsh detail, I realized what I was looking at. A white-tailed doe, probably 100 pounds, laid out on my lawn with her head toward the house, like an offering, like a message. Her belly had been opened, the organs removed with surgical precision, but the meat was untouched. The cuts were clean, impossibly clean, not the ragged tears of an animal feeding, but something deliberate, something done with tools or claws that could mimic tools. And her eyes, her dead, glassy eyes, were positioned to look directly at my back door. I stood there for a long time staring down at that carcass, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't random. This wasn't the behavior of any natural predator. This was communication. This was the thing in my woods telling me that it could come onto my property, could come right up to my house, could do whatever it wanted, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I buried the doe in the far corner of my property, working fast, not wanting Sarah to see. By the time I was done, the sun was fully up and I was covered in sweat and dirt and the peculiar smell of blood that had gotten into my clothes and wouldn't wash out. Sarah asked about the dirt when I came inside, and I told her I'd been working in the garden. Another lie. The lies were piling up now, becoming a wall between us that I didn't know how to tear down. That was when I made my decision. The thing was hunting me. I knew that now, knew it with absolute certainty. It was playing with me, demonstrating its power, showing me how helpless I was. And as long as I stayed in my house, stayed in the space between the suburbs and the woods, it would keep coming. Keep watching, keep leaving its messages until it finally decided to stop playing and finish what it had started. I had two choices. I could run, sell the house, take Sarah and Marcus, move somewhere far away from any forest, any wild space where the thing might follow. Or I could fight, go back to my property, to my hunting grounds, and face whatever was out there on my terms instead of waiting for it to come to me. The decision wasn't really a decision at all. I'd been a hunter my whole life. I knew how predators thought, how they moved, how they operated, and I knew that running from a predator only triggered its chase instinct, only made it more determined to catch you. The only way to survive a predator was to stop being prey, to become dangerous, to make it understand that hunting you would cost more than you were worth. I started preparing that same day, extra ammunition, multiple weapons, emergency supplies in case I needed to survive more than one night. I cleaned my rifles until they gleamed, loaded magazines until I had more rounds than I could possibly carry. I told Sarah I was going back to the property to do some maintenance to winterize the cabin before the heavy snow came. She didn't believe me. She never believed me anymore, but she let me go. Maybe she hoped the time alone would help me work through whatever was wrong with me. Maybe she was just tired of fighting. I drove out to the property as the sun was setting, watching the light fade behind the trees, watching the shadows stretch and deepen across the road. The fear was still there, would always be there, I suspected. But something else had joined it now, something harder, something that felt like rage, like defiance, like the desperate courage of an animal backed into a corner with nowhere left to run. I was done running, done hiding, done being prey. If that thing wanted to hunt me, I was going to make it a hunt it would never forget. I parked my truck by the cabin, but I didn't go inside. Instead, I grabbed my pack, checked my rifle one last time, and started walking into the woods, toward the deepest part of my property, toward the place where the creature seemed to disappear every time I tried to track it, toward whatever nightmare was waiting for me in the darkness between the trees. Behind me, the last light of day faded from the sky. Ahead of me, the forest waited, silent, watchful, hungry, and somewhere in that darkness, something with amber eyes and impossible intelligence watched me come, and I knew with every fiber of my being that tonight, one way or another, this was going to end. The forest swallowed me whole. I moved through the darkness with my rifle raised, flashlight mounted beneath the barrel, casting a narrow beam that seemed pathetically small against the vast blackness between the trees. Every step felt like a betrayal of basic survival instinct, every crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots announcing my presence to whatever waited in the shadows. But I kept walking. I had to keep walking, because turning back now would mean spending the rest of my life wondering, waiting, dreading the moment when the thing decided to stop playing games and come for me in my own home. The woods were silent in that wrong way I'd come to recognize, that complete absence of natural sound that meant something had frightened every living creature into stillness. No owl calls, no rustling of nocturnal animals in the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the air thick and motionless and heavy with the smell of decay. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I found the first marker. A deer skull, stripped clean of flesh, mounted on a branch at eye level. The eye sockets stared at me as my flashlight beam passed over them, and I noticed that the skull had been positioned deliberately, facing the direction I was walking, facing deeper into the forest. An invitation, or a warning. I couldn't tell which. I kept walking. The markers continued at irregular intervals. More skulls, deer, raccoon, something that might have been a large dog, all cleaned of flesh, all positioned to watch the path I was following, all pointing me towards something I didn't want to find but couldn't turn away from. The smell of copper and rot grew stronger with each step, mixing with that other smell, the one that didn't belong in any forest, the musk of something that shouldn't exist. Then I heard it, a sound that started low and built gradually, rising through frequencies that made my teeth ache and my eyes water. Not quite a growl, not quite a howl, but something in between. A vocalization that no natural animal could produce, that seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding me, filling the darkness until I couldn't tell which direction it originated from. I stopped walking, raised my rifle, swept my flashlight in a slow arc through the trees. Nothing, just darkness and silence, and the pounding of my own heart. Then the eyes appeared. Amber lights reflecting my flashlight beam, 8 feet off the ground and maybe 30 yards ahead of me. They blinked once, slowly, and then moved. Not toward me, around me. Circling, I tracked them with my rifle, trying to keep them in my sights. But they kept shifting, appearing in one place and then another, always just at the edge of my light's reach. I fired. The shot split the silence like thunder, the muzzle flash blinding me momentarily, and when my vision cleared, the eyes were gone. But I could hear movement now, heavy footfalls in the undergrowth, circling, testing, probing for weakness. I ejected the spent casing and chambered another round, my hands steady despite the terror clawing at my chest. A branch snapped behind me. I spun, rifle raised, and the flashlight beam caught something that made my mind stutter and skip like a broken record. A shape, a massive, impossible shape stepping out from behind a tree not 15 feet away. And in that moment I saw it clearly for the first time. The creature stood at least 7.5 feet tall, its shoulders as broad as a professional linebacker's, its body covered in coarse gray-brown fur that was matted in places with something dark and wet that I didn't want to identify. Its arms hung down past its hips, ending in hands, not paws, hands, with fingers that were too long and joints that bent in ways that made my stomach lurch. Each finger terminated in a curved black claw, 4 inches long at least, gleaming in my flashlight beam like obsidian knives. But it was the head that broke something inside me. Wolf. The word surfaced in my mind even as I rejected it, because what I was looking at was no wolf. The snout was too long, the skull too massive. The jaw hinged in a way that would allow it to open impossibly wide. Its ears were pointed and swiveled toward me like radar dishes, tracking every sound I made. Its eyes, those amber eyes that had haunted my nightmares, held an intelligence that no animal possessed, a calculating awareness that was somehow worse than mindless hunger. And it was smiling. I know how that sounds. I know wolves don't smile. But this thing's lips were pulled back over yellowed fangs the size of my fingers, and the expression on that nightmare face was one I recognized. Satisfaction, anticipation. The look of a predator that had finally cornered its prey and was savoring the moment before the kill. It made a sound, a low, rumbling vocalization that rose and fell like speech, like it was trying to communicate something in a language I couldn't understand but felt in my bones. The sound reached inside me and flipped switches I didn't know existed, triggered responses that were older than humanity itself, and every cell in my body screamed at me to run. I didn't run. I fired. The shot took the creature center mass, the impact staggering it back a step, and I saw black blood spray from the wound. I worked the bolt, chambered another round, fired again. 5 shots in rapid succession, each one hitting home, each one doing damage, and the creature roared, a sound that shook the trees and sent ice through my veins. But it didn't fall, it charged. I had maybe 2 seconds to react. I threw myself sideways, felt the displaced air as the creature's claws swept through the space where my head had been. And then I was rolling, scrambling, trying to get my rifle up, even as I knew it was useless. Knew that I'd put 5 rounds of .30-06 into the thing's chest and it was still coming. Its hand closed around my ankle and yanked. I hit the ground hard enough to drive the air from my lungs. And then I was being dragged backward through the undergrowth, branches and rocks tearing at my clothes and skin. I twisted, tried to bring the rifle around, but the creature's other hand came down and batted it away like a toy, sending it spinning off into the darkness. Then its face was inches from mine. The smell was overwhelming, copper and rot, and that husk that wasn't quite animal, and I could feel its breath washing over me, hot and wet and stinking of blood. Its eyes bored into mine, and in that moment I felt the full weight of its attention, its intelligence, its hunger. This was no mindless beast. This was something ancient and terrible and aware, something that had been hunting in these woods long before humans ever set foot here. Something that saw me not as food but as sport, as entertainment, as a brief diversion in an existence I couldn't begin to comprehend. It leaned closer. Its lips pulled back further, that horrible smile widening, and I saw its tongue, too long, too dark, slide across those yellowed fangs. Then it spoke. I know that's impossible. I I know that wolves don't speak, that whatever this thing was couldn't possibly produce human speech. But in that moment, with that nightmare face inches from my own, it made a sound that resolved itself into a single word, a word that I felt more than heard, a word that carved itself into my brain and would never leave. Remember. The creature released me, stepped back. Those amber eyes held mine for one eternal second, and then it turned and vanished into the darkness with a speed that defied its massive size, leaving me Yadal lying on the forest floor with my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I don't remember getting up. Don't remember finding my rifle or making my way back to my truck. The next clear memory I have is sitting behind the wheel, engine running, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. Blood was running down my face from a gash I didn't remember receiving, and my ankle throbbed where the creature had grabbed me, the pain sharp and hot and almost welcome, because it meant I was still alive. I put the truck in gear and drove. Not toward the main road, not toward town. Toward the cabin, because the creature was behind me now, and the cabin was shelter, and I needed walls between me and that thing, needed doors I could lock and windows I could watch. It was waiting for me. I saw it as I came around the last bend, standing in the clearing in front of the cabin, illuminated by my headlights. It didn't move as I approached, just stood there with that impossible height and those amber eyes, reflecting the light like twin flames. And I realized with a horror that went beyond anything I'd felt before that it had been toying with me, that it could have killed me at any moment but had chosen not to, that every encounter, every close call, every narrow escape had been allowed. I didn't slow down. I pressed the accelerator to the floor and aimed the truck directly at that nightmare shape. And in the last instant before impact, I saw something change in its expression. Surprise, maybe, or respect, or something I couldn't identify. Then 2 tons of steel and momentum slammed into it at 50 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. The creature went over the hood, its body smashing against the windshield hard enough to spider the glass. And I felt the sickening crunch as my truck's front end crumpled against something that should have been too solid to move. I kept my foot on the gas, kept pushing, and the creature rolled off the side of the hood as I plowed past, leaving a smear of black blood across the driver's side window. I didn't stop. Didn't look back. I drove through my own fence across the neighboring field and hit the county road at 60 miles per hour, fishtailing wildly before I got control of the wheel. My truck was making sounds it shouldn't make, the engine knocking, something grinding in the front end, but it kept going and I kept driving. 20 miles to the sheriff's station. I don't remember a single one of them. I do remember the deputy's face when I staggered through the door. I must have looked like something out of a horror movie, covered in blood and dirt, my clothes torn, my eyes wide and wild. I remember trying to speak and having nothing come out but a sound that might have been a sob or a scream or both. I remember someone guiding me to a chair, someone else calling for an ambulance, voices asking questions I couldn't answer. They found the damage to my truck. 3 deep gouges in the hood. The metal peeled back like it had been raked by industrial machinery, and a dent in the front bumper shaped like something large and solid had hit it at speed. They found blood. Black blood that one of the deputies said smelled wrong, that clotted in strange patterns and wouldn't wash off the paint no matter how hard they scrubbed. They went back to my property with spotlights and shotguns, expecting to find a bare carcass or some evidence of what I'd hit. They found drag marks instead, a trail of that black blood leading from my driveway across the clearing and into the deepest part of the forest, disappearing into undergrowth so thick no human could follow. They found my rifle, 20 feet from where I dropped it, the barrel bent at an angle that suggested it had been stepped on by something impossibly heavy. They didn't find a body. The official report said I'd encountered a large predator, possibly a bear, and that I'd struck it with my vehicle in self-defense. The gouges were listed as damage from the animal's claws during the initial encounter. The bent rifle was attributed to the chaos of the attack. No one asked too many questions, and I didn't volunteer any answers. What was I supposed to tell them? That I'd seen a werewolf? That it had spoken to me? That it was still out there in those woods, wounded but not dead, with blood that didn't clot right, and eyes that held human intelligence, and a smile that promised this wasn't over? They would have committed me. They might have been right to. I spent 3 days in the hospital. Minor injuries, they said, lacerations, contusions, a sprained ankle, some cardiac irregularities brought on by extreme stress. They kept me under observation while they ran tests, while they tried to figure out why a 53-year-old man with no history of mental illness was waking up screaming every time he closed his eyes. Sarah came the first day. She sat by my bed and held my hand and didn't ask questions. And when I finally tried to explain what had happened, when the words started spilling out in a jumbled mess of terror and disbelief, she listened, just listened. And when I was done, when I'd told her everything from the first wrongness to the final impact, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't read and said something I'll never forget. We're selling the property, we're moving, and we're never talking about this again. Not because she didn't believe me. I saw it in her eyes, the way they widened when I described the creature, the way her hand tightened on mine when I told her about the word it had spoken. She believed me, or at least she believed that I believed that something had happened in those woods that had changed me in ways that couldn't be undone. But she also understood that there was nothing to be done about it. No authority to contact, no expert to consult, no solution that would make sense to anyone who hadn't seen what I had seen. The only option was to run, to put as much distance as possible between us and those woods and whatever still hunted there. We sold the property at a loss. I didn't care. I would have given it away for free just to be rid of it, to sever any connection between myself and that place where the world had shown me its true face. The buyer was a developer from out of state, some company that wanted to turn the land into vacation cabins for wealthy tourists. I thought about warning them, thought about telling someone what was out there in those woods. But who would believe me? And what good would a warning do against something like that? I gave away my rifles. All of them, even the ones that had been in my family for generations. I couldn't look at them without remembering the way 5 rounds of .30-06 had barely slowed that creature down, the way it had swatted my weapon aside like it was nothing. Guns made me feel safe my whole life. Now they just reminded me how little safety actually existed in the world. I transferred to a new trucking route, urban deliveries, city streets, places where the biggest dangers were traffic and deadlines. No more long hauls through rural areas. No more stops at remote truck stops surrounded by forest. My boss thought I'd lost my mind, turning down the premium routes for city work that paid less and stressed more. I let him think that. It was easier than the truth. We moved to a subdivision outside Lansing. Cookie-cutter houses, postage stamp lawns, neighbors so close you could hear them sneeze through the walls. I'd spent my whole life hating places like this, hating the way they stripped the wilderness down to manicured parks and decorative shrubbery. Now I loved every concrete sidewalk, every street light, every square foot of paved-over nature. The nearest real forest was 30 miles away. The nearest woods were a 5-acre park with jogging trails and families walking dogs. Marcus thought I'd had a breakdown. Maybe I had. He was 17 then, already pulling away from his parents the way teenagers do, and my sudden transformation from outdoorsman to suburban hermit just accelerated the process. We don't talk much anymore. He's at college now, studying engineering, building a life that has no room for a father who sleeps with the lights on and won't explain why. Sometimes I think about telling him the truth. Then I remember the look in Sarah's eyes when I told her, the way she understood immediately that some knowledge is too heavy to share, and I stay silent. Sarah stayed. God knows why. We share a bed, but we don't really share a life anymore, not the way we used to. There's a wall between us now, built of things I can't say and things she won't ask. She pretends not to notice the shotgun I keep by the nightstand, pretends not to hear me when I pace the house at 3 a.m, checking locks, watching shadows. She's made her peace with the man I've become, even if that man is just a hollowed-out version of who I used to be. It's been 4 years now. 4 years since I felt that creature's breath on my face. 4 years since I heard that word, remember, carved into my brain. 4 years of suburban safety in urban roots and sleeping with every light in the house blazing. It hasn't been enough. I still dream about the woods, still wake up sweating, certain that something is watching me from just outside the window. Still catch myself scanning tree lines whenever I pass a forest, looking for shapes that don't belong, for eyes that reflect light at the wrong height. The world I live in now is a thin shell stretched over a darkness I can never forget, a comfortable illusion that could shatter at any moment, because I know now what's out there. Not just in Michigan, not just in those woods, everywhere. The wilderness isn't empty. The darkness between the trees isn't safe. There are things that hunt in the wild places, things that were old before humans learned to make fire, things that watch and study and wait. And one of them knows my face. I think about that sometimes. About the creature's intelligence, its deliberate behavior, its apparent ability to communicate. About the word it spoke and what it might have meant. Remember what? Remember that night? Remember what I saw? Remember what I am now? Prey that escaped? A target that got lucky? An exception to some ancient rule I'll never understand? Or maybe it meant something else entirely? Maybe it was telling me to remember because it wanted me to spread the word, to let other people know what was out there. Maybe I was always meant to survive, always meant to tell this story, to serve as a warning to anyone foolish enough to venture into the deep woods alone. I don't know. I'll never know. And that uncertainty is almost worse than the terror, because it means there's no closure, no resolution, no ending that makes sense. The creature is still out there. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe I really did kill it when I hit it with my truck, and my fear is just the echo of a trauma that will never fully heal. But I don't think so. Some nights I wake up absolutely certain that something is standing outside my suburban home, watching from the edge of the streetlight's reach. Some nights I hear sounds that don't belong, a low vocalization that might be wind through the trees or might be something else entirely. Some nights I feel the weight of amber eyes on me, even though I'm miles from any forest, any wild space where such a thing could hide. Maybe it's following me. Maybe it's waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity, the right circumstances to finish what it started in those Michigan woods. Or maybe it's content to let me live, to let me carry the memory of that night, like a brand burned into my soul. I keep the shotgun by my bed. I keep the lights on. I keep telling myself that I'm safe here, that concrete and street lights and neighbors are protection enough against a nightmare I'm not even sure I really saw. But I know better. Some things don't forget. Some things don't forgive. And some things, the oldest things, the things that were here before us and will be here long after we're gone, have all the time in the world to wait. I survived an encounter with something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, that science says can't exist, that the rational part of my brain still insists I must have imagined. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I know what I heard when that creature leaned close and whispered a single word into the darkness between us. Remember, I do. Every single day, every single night, every moment of every hour for the rest of my life. Because that's what I am now. That's what that night made me. Not a hunter, not a trucker, not a husband or a father or any of the things I used to think defined me. I'm a witness, a survivor, a man who saw behind the curtain and can never forget what was there. And somewhere out there, in the deep woods and the dark spaces and the wilderness that still covers so much of this world, something with amber eyes and impossible intelligence knows exactly who I am. It remembers too.